The exile. The cold of space was nothing compared to the cold in Daniel. Crossed his heart as the transport ship's doors opened and the guards shoved him forward onto the frozen ground of Ashar 7. A world so far from Earth that the sun looked like just another distant star in the endless black sky above. He stumbled and fell to his knees, the ice cutting through his thin prison uniform as the bitter wind howled around him like a hungry beast searching for prey. Behind him, the transport's engines roared back to life, and he did not turn to watch it leave because he already knew what he would see. Nothing but the fading glow of humanity abandoning one of its own commander, Daniel Cross. They had called him once hero of the Terran Collective, defender of 3 colony worlds, the man who had saved more lives than anyone could count. Now they called him traitor, exile, and soon they would call him nothing at all because dead men have no names. Pushed himself to his feet and looked around at the wasteland that would become his grave. And he laughed a harsh sound that the wind snatched away immediately. The collective had chosen well, he thought, because Ashar 7 was a planet of eternal winter where temperatures dropped so low at night that exposed skin would freeze solid in minutes and where the sun barely rose. Above the horizon, even at midday, they had given him a survival pack with 30 days of rations, a thermal jacket, a small heating unit with limited fuel, and knife. It was a death sentence dressed up as mercy, and everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing. Daniel remembered the trial, if it could even be called that. He remembered standing before the council as they read out the charges against him: insubordination, treason, aiding the enemy, conduct unbecoming an officer of the Terran Collective. He remembered the faces of the men and women who had once saluted him, now looking at him with cold eyes full of judgment. "You refused a direct order," Admiral Patricia Cole had said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You allowed enemy combatants to escape when you should have eliminated them." "They were prisoners," Daniel had replied, keeping his voice steady even though his hands wanted to shake with anger. "They had surrendered. They were unarmed. Executing them would have been murder, not war. They were draconis." The Admiral had spat the word like it tasted foul. "They are not people. They are monsters, and you let monsters walk free." Daniel had looked at her then, really looked at her, and he had seen something that made his stomach turn, hatred so deep and so old that it had become her entire identity. She did not see the draconis as living beings with families and hopes and fears. She saw them only as targets, as problems to be solved with violence. "I did what was right." He had said simply, "Then you will die for what was right," she had answered. And the council had nodded in agreement. Now, here he was, alone on a frozen world at the edge of known space. And the only company he had was the howling wind and the crushing weight of his own memories. He walked for hours that first day, searching for anything that might serve as shelter. The landscape was brutal and beautiful, in equal measure vast plains of ice that sparkled like diamonds under the pale light. Mountains in the distance that looked like the bones of some ancient giant. And everywhere the endless white that seemed to swallow sound and hope alike as the sun began its rapid descent toward the horizon. Daniel found what he was looking for: the ruins of an old mining facility, abandoned decades ago when the company that built it had gone bankrupt. The main structure had collapsed, but some of the outer buildings were still standing, their walls thick enough to block the worst of the wind. He made his camp in what had once been a storage room, using pieces of broken equipment to reinforce the walls and ceiling. The heating unit sputtered to life and filled the small space with warmth that felt almost miraculous after hours in the cold. He ate his first ration pack slowly, savoring every bite because he knew that these supplies would not last forever. That night, as he lay in the darkness listening to the wind scream outside, Daniel thought about the choices that had brought him here. He had been a soldier for 20 years. And in that time, he had seen the best and worst of humanity. He had watched men sacrifice themselves to save strangers, and he had watched men murder innocents without a flicker of remorse. He had learned that the uniform did not make the hero, and that following orders was not always the same as doing right. The war with the Draconis had been raging for 40 years, longer than Daniel had been alive. No one even remembered anymore how it had started. Some said it was a border dispute. Others said it was a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. And still others whispered that the governments on both sides had wanted war and had manufactured the excuse they needed to start on. Daniel knew was that he had spent most of his adult life fighting beings he did not hate, killing because he was told to kill, and watching good people die for reasons that no one could explain. The Battle of Vega Prime had changed everything. His unit had captured a group of Draconis soldiers, 37 of them, including wounded and young ones who could not have been more than adolescents. They had surrendered peacefully, laying down their weapons and kneeling with their clawed hands raised in the universal gesture of submission. The order had come from command. No prisoners. Eliminate all hostiles. Daniel had looked at those 37 beings, at their strange reptilian faces and their eyes that held the same fear he had seen in human eyes 1,000 times before. And he had made a choice. He had told his soldiers to stand down. He had opened a corridor and let the Draconis escape into the forest. He had watched them disappear into the trees. And he had felt something he had not felt in years. Patient of his own soldiers had reported him. And within hours he had been arrested, stripped of his rank, and thrown into a cell to await judgment. He did not regret it. Lying there in the cold darkness of Ashara 7, with nothing but uncertainty ahead of him, Daniel Cross did not regret a single moment of what he had done. Those 37 Draconis were alive because of him, and that was worth more than medals or honors, or the approval of people who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The next morning, he began the work of survival. He learned to hunt the ice elk that roamed the frozen plains. Massive creatures with thick white fur and antlers that spread like frozen lightning. He learned which plants could be eaten and which would kill him. He learned to read the weather and the color of the sky, and to predict storms before they arrived. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The loneliness was a constant companion, heavier than the cold and more persistent than the hunger. There were moments when Daniel wondered if the collective had been right, if dying quickly would have been better than this slow fade into nothing. But every time those thoughts crept in, he pushed them away. He had survived too much to give up now, and somewhere deep inside him, a stubborn flame refused to be extinguished. He did not know that his life was about to change forever. He did not know that in the ice caves beneath the glacier, something was waiting for him, something that would give his exile meaning, and his death a purpose greater than he could ever imagine. Daniel Cross had come to Ashara 7 to die. But the universe had other plans. The next 3 months into his exile, Daniel discovered that he was not alone on Ashara 7. He had been tracking an ice elk through the glacier fields when a sudden storm forced him to seek shelter. The wind had come out of nowhere, a wall of white that reduced visibility to nothing and dropped the temperature so fast that even his thermal jacket struggled to keep him warm. He needed to find cover immediately, or he would freeze to death within the hour. The entrance to the ice cave was almost invisible, just a narrow crack in the face of the glacier that he would have missed entirely if he had not stumbled directly into it. He squeezed through the opening and found himself in a tunnel that wound deep into the ice, the walls glowing with a faint blue light that seemed to come from the frozen water itself. Daniel moved carefully, one hand on the wall to guide him in the dim light. The tunnel opened into larger chambers as he went deeper, and the temperature actually rose slightly, still cold enough to see his breath, but no longer the killing cold of the surface. It was in the deepest chamber that he found them 7 eggs, each one roughly the size of his torso. arranged in a careful circle on a bed of some kind of metallic material that Daniel did not recognize. They glowed with a soft inner light, colors shifting like captured starlight, silver and blue and pale gold, dancing beneath shells that looked almost translucent. Daniel's breath caught in his throat because he knew immediately what he was looking at. These were Draconis eggs, and the fact that they were here, on this forgotten world at the edge of nowhere, could only mean one thing. He looked around the chamber and saw her, the female Draconis, lay against the far wall. Her massive body curled protectively, even in death. Her wings, which would have spanned 20 feet when fully extended, were wrapped around empty air, as if she had been trying to embrace something that was no longer there. Frost covered her scales, and her eyes, those strange vertical pupils that had haunted human nightmares for decades, stared at nothing. She had been dead for some time, Daniel realized. Days at least, maybe longer. The cold had preserved her body, frozen her in this final moment of desperate protection. He moved closer and saw the wounds on her flanks, burns from plasma weapons, the kind that human ships carried. Someone had shot her down, and she had crawled into this cave to die, using the last of her strength to arrange her eggs and wrap them in whatever warmth she could provide. Daniel knelt beside the nest and felt something crack open inside his chest. He had killed Draconis before. He had fought them in the void between stars and on the surfaces of a dozen worlds. He had seen them as the enemy, as threats to be neutralized, as obstacles standing between humanity and its manifest destiny among the stars. But he had never seen this: a mother who had given everything for her children, who had dragged her broken body into a frozen cave and died trying to keep her eggs warm. The eggs were still alive. He could see the faint pulse of light within each one, could almost feel the warmth radiating from them despite the cold. But that warmth was fading, and without a heat source, they would be dead within days. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his mind racing through options that did not exist. He could leave. No one would ever know. These were the children of his enemies, the offspring of creatures that humanity had been trying to exterminate for 40 years. Every protocol, every training session, every order he had ever received told him to walk away and let nature take its course. But he had already broken those rules once, had already chosen mercy over duty, and it had cost him everything. What more could they take from him now? He stripped off his thermal jacket and draped it over the eggs, tucking it carefully around them to trap whatever warmth remained. Then he gathered dry moss from the tunnel walls and built a small fire pit at the center of the chamber, using the last of his emergency fuel to coax flames from the frozen kindling. The fire caught and held, casting dancing shadows across the ice walls. And Daniel settled in for what he knew would be a long vigil. Days passed, and then weeks. Daniel rationed his supplies with brutal efficiency, eating less than he needed so that he could spend more time in the cave with the eggs. He made trips to the surface to hunt and gather fuel, but he never stayed away longer than necessary, because every hour he was gone was an hour the eggs spent getting colder. He talked to them. It seemed foolish at first, speaking to eggs that could not hear or understand, but the silence of the cave was crushing, and he needed something to fill it. He told them about Earth, about the blue oceans and the green forests and the way the sun felt on your skin on a summer day. He told them about his childhood, about his parents and his sister and the dog they had owned that used to sleep at the foot of his bed. He told them about humanity, about the good parts that so many people seem to have forgotten. He told them about kindness and compassion and the way that strangers would sometimes help each other for no reason at all, except that it was the right thing to do. He told them about love, about sacrifice, about the moments when people chose to be better than their worst instincts. "Your mother loved you," he said one night, his voice rough from cold and disuse. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens, wherever you end up, remember that she died trying to save you. That kind of love, it means something. It has to mean something. The eggs pulsed with light, and Daniel liked to imagine they were listening. His supplies dwindled to nothing. His fuel ran out, and he burned his extra clothes to keep the fire going. He grew thin and weak, his body consuming itself to stay alive. Frostbite claimed his fingers, turning them black and numb. But he kept feeding the fire because stopping was not an option on the 38th day of his vigil. The first egg cracked. Daniel was half asleep, propped against the cave wall with his arms wrapped around his chest for warmth. When he heard the sound, a tiny tapping from inside the silver egg, followed by a crack that spread across the shell like lightning across a summer sky, he scrambled forward, ignoring the pain in his frozen joints, and watched as a small snout pushed through the shell. Scales the color of moonlight caught the firelight and sparkled with impossible beauty. Eyes that were ancient and new at the same time blinked open and looked directly at him. The hatchling made a sound something between a chirp and a growl, and tumbled out of its shell onto the warm metallic bed. It was no bigger than a house cat, its wings still wet and folded against its back, its tail curling and uncurling as it tried to make sense of this strange new world. "Hey there, little one," Daniel whispered, reaching out with a trembling hand. The hatchling sniffed his fingers, then pressed its head against his palm with a soft rumble of contentment. "Welcome to the universe." Over the next 3 days, the other eggs hatched one by one. 7 dragons in total, each one different, silver and blue and gold and green, but all of them looking at Daniel with the same trusting eyes, the same instinctive knowledge that this strange, warm creature was their protector. Daniel held them against his chest and let them sleep in the curve of his arms. He fed them what little food he had left and melted ice for them to drink. He sang songs he remembered from childhood and made up stories about brave little dragons who would grow up to do amazing things. He knew he was dying. His body was failing, his lungs filling with fluid, his heart struggling to keep beating in the relentless cold. But every time he looked at those 7 small faces, he found the strength to keep going for 1 more hour. 1 more day. He had come to Ashar 7 as an exile, a man with no purpose and no future. But here in this frozen cave, surrounded by enemies that had become his children, Daniel Cross had finally found something worth dying for. The Last Stand. The Terran Collective had not forgotten about Ashar 7, and they had not forgotten about the man. They had left there to die. A routine patrol ship, passing through the system, detected an unusual heat signature on the planet's surface, too concentrated and too consistent to be natural. Command flagged it as a potential security concern and dispatched a small team to investigate. After all, the frozen world was supposed to be empty, except for one exile who should have been dead. Months ago, Captain Laura Kent led the investigation squad, a team of 6 soldiers equipped for Arctic conditions and ready for anything. She had been given one simple order: identify the source of the heat signature and eliminate any threats. No one expected to find anything alive down there, least of all the man they had sent to death by abandonment. The shuttle landed a kilometer from the glacier, and Laura led her team through the howling wind toward the heat source. Her sensors guided her to the crack in the ice that marked the entrance to the cave system, and she felt a strange unease settle into her stomach as she squeezed through the narrow opening. She knew this planet. She knew who had been left here, and some part of her, the part she tried very hard to ignore, hoped they would find nothing but frozen bones. What they found instead made her blood run cold. Daniel Cross stood at the center of the deepest chamber, his body gaunt and broken, his skin pale as the ice that surrounded him. Behind him, huddled together on a bed of shimmering metal, were 7 small dragons, draconis hatchlings with scales that caught the light of the dying fire and reflected it back in colors that seemed impossible. He should not have been able to stand. Lavra could see that just by looking at him. His fingers were black with frostbite, his lips were cracked and bleeding, and his eyes were sunken deep into a face that had lost too much weight. But when he saw the soldiers enter the chamber, something changed in those eyes, a fire that had nothing to do with the embers behind him. "Stand down." "Cross," Lavra ordered, her voice echoing off the frozen walls. She kept her weapon lowered but ready, hoping that this could end without violence. "Those are enemy combatants," Daniel laughed. And the sound made Laura's heart ache, because it was the laugh of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. "They are babies." "Lavra," he said, and she flinched at the use of her first name. They had served together once, years ago, before the war had twisted everything into shapes that no longer made sense. "They have not even opened their eyes to the stars yet. Orders are orders," she replied, falling back on the only defense she had against the doubt that was creeping into her mind. "Then your orders are wrong." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Lavra remembered another time, another place, when Daniel had said something similar. She remembered the Battle of Vega Prime and the prisoners he had released, and the way the Council had destroyed him for showing mercy. She had thought he was a fool then. Looking at him now, broken and dying but still standing between her guns and 7 helpless creatures, she was not so sure. "I cannot let you walk away from this," she said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "Command knows we are here. They are waiting for a report. If I tell them I found nothing, they will send someone else. Then tell them you found nothing. You know, I cannot do that." Daniel nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. Then he did something that made Laura's breath catch in her throat. He stepped forward, away from the hatchlings, and spread his arms wide. "You will have to go through me," he said simply. The soldiers behind Lavra shifted nervously. One of them, a young man named Kyle, raised his rifle and sighted down the barrel at Daniel's chest. "Captain, we have a clear shot." Lavra did not respond. She was staring at Daniel, at the man who had once been her commanding officer, at the hero who had saved her life during a firefight on Kepler Station when she was barely out of training. She remembered the way he had carried her through the smoke and flames, how he had refused to leave her behind, even when the ceiling was collapsing around them. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you die for them?" Daniel lowered his arms slightly and looked back at the hatchlings. The little dragons were awake now, watching the confrontation with wide eyes that held no understanding of danger. Only curiosity about these new creatures that had entered their world. "Because someone has to," he said, turning back to face her. "Because if we cannot show mercy to the helpless, then we have already lost the war, not to the Draconis, but to ourselves. Because 40 years of killing has not brought us peace, has not made us safer, has only filled the universe with grief and rage, and children who grow up knowing nothing but hate." He gestured at the hatchlings behind him. "Look at them, Lavra. Really look. They did not choose this war. They did not kill anyone. They are just babies, just like human babies. And they want the same things all babies want: warmth and safety and someone to love them. How can I call myself human if I let them die just because their blood is a different color than mine?" Kyle stepped forward, his rifle still raised. "Captain," he is stalling. "We need to complete the mission." Lavra held up her hand to stop him. Her mind was racing, memories and doubts and questions crashing together like waves against a shore. She thought about the reports she had read, the casualty lists that grew longer every year, the faces of friends who had not come home. She thought about the Draconis she had killed and the ones she had watched die in the way. She had trained herself not to see them as anything other than targets. She thought about what Daniel had said, that the war had made them lose themselves. "Stand down," she said. Kyle blinked in confusion. "Captain?" "I said stand down. All of you." The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, but they lowered their weapons. Laura took a deep breath and stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and Daniel until she was close enough to see the tears frozen on his cheeks. "We found nothing here," she said, loud enough for her team to hear. "The Exile is dead." The heat signature was a natural phenomenon. There is no nest. There are no draconis. Do you understand? The soldiers nodded one by one, and Laura saw something in their eyes that surprised her. Not resentment or confusion, but relief. Maybe she was not the only one who had doubts, who had questions that kept her awake at night, who wondered if there was another way. She reached into her pack and pulled out a medical kit and a bundle of emergency rations. It was against every regulation, every protocol, every direct order she had ever received. It was probably treason, and if anyone found out, she would end up on a frozen world, just like this one. She handed the supplies to Daniel anyway. "This is all I can do," she said, her voice rough with emotion she did not fully understand. "It is not enough, but it is more than enough," Daniel replied. And he smiled a real smile, warm despite the cold, full of gratitude and something else that looked almost like peace. "Thank you, Laura." She turned away before he could see the tears forming in her own eyes. She led her team back through the tunnels, back to the surface, back to the shuttle that would carry them away from this frozen world and its impossible secret behind her. Daniel Cross sank to his knees and gathered the hatchlings against his chest, holding them close while his broken body trembled with exhaustion. He knew the supplies would not save him. His body was too far gone, too damaged by weeks of cold and hunger and sacrifice. But it did not matter anymore. Laura had made a choice, just like he had made a choice on Vega Prime. She had chosen mercy over duty, compassion over orders, and that meant something. It meant that humanity was not lost, that the light he had been trying to protect still burned somewhere in the hearts of his people. He held the dragons close and whispered words of comfort into their tiny ears. And for the first time in months, he felt something like hope. The passing the supplies that Captain Laura Kent had left behind gave Daniel Cross 11 more days. And he used every single one of them. He rationed the food with the same careful discipline he had applied to everything else, dividing it into portions that would keep the hatchlings fed while leaving, just enough for himself to maintain the strength needed to tend the fire. The medical kit helped with the pain, dulling the sharp edges of his frostbite and the deep ache in his lungs. But he knew that no medicine could fix what was broken inside him. His body was shutting down. He could feel it happening, could sense the slow failure of systems that had kept him alive for 43 years. His heart stuttered and skipped. His breathing grew more labored with each passing day. His vision blurred at the edges, and sometimes he forgot where he was or why he was there, but he never forgot the hatchlings that he had grown in the days since their birth, their scales hardening and their wings beginning to unfurl. The eldest, the one with scales like moonlight, who had been the first to hatch, had started to make small chirping sounds that Daniel liked to think were attempts at communication. She would press her snout against his hand and rumble with contentment, and he would stroke her head and tell her stories about worlds she would never see. "There is a place called Earth," he whispered to her one night, his voice barely audible above the crackle of the dying fire. "It is far away from here, so far that light itself takes years to make the journey. But it is beautiful, more beautiful than I have words to describe. There are mountains that touch the clouds and oceans that stretch to the horizon and forests so green that they seem to glow." The hatchling tilted her head, watching him with those ancient eyes. "I wish I could take you there," Daniel continued. "I wish I could show you the sunrise over the Pacific. The way the sky turns pink and gold and orange like someone spilled paint across the heavens. I wish you could feel grass beneath your feet and swim in water that is not frozen solid." He coughed. and the sound rattled in his chest like stones in an empty jar. "But I think you are going to have to discover those things for yourself. I think my journey is almost over." The hatchlings seemed to understand something of what he was saying, because they pressed closer to him, their small bodies warm against his failing flesh. They had imprinted on him in the first days of their lives, had learned to associate his presence with safety and warmth and love. They did not know that he was not their true parent, did not understand that he was the enemy their people had been fighting for 40 years to them. He was simply the warm one, the creature who sang in the darkness and kept the cold away on the 49th day of his vigil. Daniel Cross felt his heart begin to slow. He was sitting against the cave wall with the hatchlings arranged around him, their small bodies rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the chamber that made the ice walls look like they were bleeding light. Outside, the wind had finally stopped, and the silence was so complete that Daniel could hear his own pulse slow, irregular, fading. He was not afraid. He had made peace with death a long time ago, had accepted that his exile was a one-way journey. What he had not expected was to find meaning in his final days, to discover a purpose that made the ending worthwhile. He looked down at the sleeping dragons and felt his heart swell with something that had no name, a love so fierce and so pure that it burned brighter than any fire he had ever kindled. "I am sorry I could not do more," he whispered. "I am sorry I could not stay longer. But I want you to know that these weeks with you, they have been the best of my life. You have given me something I did not know I was missing." He reached out with trembling hands and touched each of them in turn, memorizing the texture of their scales, the warmth of their small bodies, the gentle pulse of life that flowed through them. "Be good," he said, his voice breaking. "Be kind. Remember that the universe is full of beings who are different from you, and that difference does not make them enemies. Remember that mercy is not weakness, and that love is the strongest force in all of creation." His eyes were growing heavy, and the darkness at the edges of his vision was creeping inward. He could feel his body relaxing, the tension of survival finally draining away as his muscles gave up their desperate grip on life. "Your mother died trying to protect you," he continued, though he was no longer sure if he was speaking aloud or just thinking the words. "She loved you more than anything in the universe. And I loved you too. I want you to know that. I loved you from the moment I saw you, and I would do it all again. Every frozen night and every hungry day, just to see you open your eyes." He took one last breath, felt the cold air fill his lungs, and let it go. The hatchlings woke when his heart stopped beating. They felt the warmth begin to fade from his body and press closer, confused and frightened by this change they did not understand. The eldest, the Moonlight One, pushed her snout against his face and made a sound that echoed through the chamber, a keen of grief that carried frequencies no human ear could hear. The call traveled through the ice and out across the frozen plains, rising into the sky and beyond, a signal of distress that crossed the vast distances of space faster than any ship could fly 3 days later. A Draconis warship dropped out of hyperspace above Ashara 7 Commander. Varteth stood on the bridge and watched the frozen world grow larger in the view screen. He was an old soldier, scarred by 30 years of war, and he had come expecting to find tragedy. The distress signal from the hatchling was something his people had not heard in generations, a cry that spoke of loss and desperation, and the death of a guardian. What he found in that ice cave stopped him in his tracks. Human sat against the wall with 7 hatchlings curled against his body, their scales pressed tight to his frozen flesh. His eyes were closed and his face was peaceful, and though death had claimed him, the position of his body made it clear that his final act had been one of protection. Vorth had killed humans before. He had watched them die in the vacuum of space and on the burning surfaces of contested worlds. He had hated them for decades, had blamed them for every loss his people had suffered. But standing in that cave, looking at what this human had done, he felt something crack open inside him. The hatchlings looked up at him with wide eyes. And one of them, the silver one with scales like moonlight, made a sound that Varteth recognized. It was a word in the old language, a word that hatchlings used for their parents. Warm one, she said. The warm one is cold now. Varteth knelt beside the human's body and studied his face. This man had been an enemy, a soldier who had fought against the Draconis in battles that had claimed thousands of lives. He should have been a monster, a villain, something easy to hate instead. He had given everything to save 7 lives that were not his own. What was his name? Varteth asked. Though he knew the hatchlings could not answer, the silver one pressed her head against the human's frozen hand. He was the warm one, she said again. He sang to us in the dark. He told us stories about a world with blue water and green trees. He said his journey was ending, but ours was just beginning. Varteth removed his command cloak, a symbol of rank and honor that he had worn for 20 years, and draped it over the human's body. It was a gesture of respect that his people reserved for their greatest warriors. And some part of him knew that his subordinates would question his decision. He did not care. Then we will give him a name, Varteth said, his voice rough with emotions he had not felt in decades. We will remember him. We will tell his story to our children and their children after them. He will not be forgotten. He gathered the hatchlings and carried them to his ship, but not before ordering his crew to retrieve the human's body with the same care they would show to a fallen hero of their own kind. Daniel Cross had died in exile. A traitor, a man abandoned by his own people. But he would be buried as something else entirely, a bridge between 2 worlds. A light in the darkness, and the first spark of a peace that would change the universe forever. The Myth 100 years is a long time in the lives of mortals, but it is barely a heartbeat in the memory of dragons. The war between humanity and the Draconis did not end with a single battle or a decisive victory. It ended slowly, in whispers and questions, and the gradual realization that neither side could remember any more why they were fighting. It ended in the stories that Draconis mothers told their children about a human who had given his life for 7 eggs in a frozen cave. It ended in the doubts that crept into human hearts when they heard those stories and wondered if perhaps they had been wrong all along. The Tree of Ashar was signed 100 years to the day after Daniel Cross drew his last breath. Delegates from both species gathered on the frozen world where he had died, in a great hall that had been built over the entrance to the ice caves. The Draconis had wanted this location, had insisted on it despite the logistical challenges, because they said it was holy ground, a place where their people had learned that humans were capable of more than war. Eldest of the 7 hatchlings Daniel had saved, stood at the center of the ceremony. She had grown into a magnificent creature, her scales still shimmering with that same moonlight glow that had caught Daniel's eye on the day she was born. Her wings could span 100 feet when fully extended, and her eyes held the wisdom of a century spent thinking about what one human had done and what it meant for both their peoples. Her name was Lyra, and she had taken the title of First Ambassador, the first of her kind to extend a claw of friendship to humanity instead of a weapon. She carried with her a tattered thermal jacket, faded and worn, but preserved with the same care that humans showed to their most precious artifacts. It had been Daniel's jacket, the one he had wrapped around the eggs on that first night in the cave, and Lyra kept it in a climate-controlled case that never left her side. This belonged to a man named Daniel Cross, she said, her voice carrying through the great hall in frequencies that both humans and Draconis could hear. He was not our father by blood, but he was our father in every way that mattered. He taught us that kindness has no species, that love knows no boundaries, that the smallest act of mercy can echo across the stars for generations. She looked out at the assembled. Delegates, humans in their formal uniforms. Draconis in their ceremonial scales, and saw something she had been waiting 100 years to see. "Oh, my siblings and I have spent our lives carrying his message to our people. We have told his story in every temple, every school, every gathering place across 100 worlds. And now I tell it to you, the children of his own species, so that you may know what kind of man he was." In the front row of the human delegation, an old woman wiped tears from her eyes. Her name was Elena Kent, and she was the granddaughter of Captain Lavra Kent, the soldier who had chosen mercy over orders in that frozen cave a century ago. She had grown up hearing stories about Daniel Cross, about the choice her grandmother had made, about the ripples that had spread outward from that single moment of compassion Elena had dedicated her life to making sure those ripples never stopped. The Draconis have a they concept that does not translate perfectly into human language. Lyra continued. We call it the eternal warmth, the idea that acts of love and kindness create heat that never fades, that passes from soul to soul across time and space until it has touched every corner of the universe. Daniel Cross did not know about this concept when he wrapped his jacket around our eggs, but he lived it. He became it. And now his warmth lives in all of us. She stepped forward and placed the jacket on a pedestal at the center of the hall, and both sides fell silent in reverence. This treaty we signed today is not just a piece of paper, Lyra said. It is the fulfillment of a promise made by one dying man to 7 unborn children. He told us to be good, to be kind, to remember that difference does not make enemies. He told us that mercy is strength and that love is the most powerful force in creation. And we have tried every day for 100 years. We have tried to honor his words. She turned to face the human delegation directly. You exiled him because he showed mercy to our prisoners. You sent him to die alone on a frozen world because he refused to murder the helpless. But I stand before you today as proof that his mercy was not wasted. I and my siblings are alive because of what he did, and because we are alive. This peace is possible. Admiral Christopher Bradley, the highest-ranking human officer present, rose from his seat and walked to the center of the hall. He was a young man by the standards of his position, barely 50 years old. But he carried himself with the weight of someone who understood the significance of this moment on behalf of the Terran Collective, he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I want to offer a formal apology to the Draconis people for the wrongs we have committed. But more than that, I want to offer our gratitude to Ambassador Lyra and her siblings for keeping the memory of Daniel Cross alive. We forgot what he taught us, but you remembered. And because you remembered, we have a chance to learn it again. He extended his hand, palm up in the gesture of friendship that humans used. Lyra placed her clawed hand over his, and 100 cameras captured the moment that would define the next 1,000 years of galactic history on Earth. In a small town in Montana, a statue stood in the center of a quiet park. Showed a man with his arms spread wide, his face turned toward the sky, his body positioned as if he were shielding something precious behind him. The sculptor had worked from old photographs and written descriptions, trying to capture not just Daniel's appearance, but his spirit, the fierce compassion, the stubborn hope, the love that had burned bright enough to light the darkness of a frozen world. The plaque at the base of the statue read simply, Commander Daniel Cross, exiled for mercy, remembered for love every year on the anniversary of his death. Draconis ships would appear in Earth's sky, not as invaders or conquerors, but as pilgrims come to pay their respects. They would hover above the park in Montana and broadcast the song of remembrance, a melody in frequencies that made human hearts ache with emotions. They could not name. The people of that small town had grown used to these visitors. Children would gather in the park and wave at the ships. And sometimes the Draconis would descend in small groups to lay offerings at the base of the statue flowers from distant worlds, crystals that glowed with inner light. Crystals that glowed with inner light. Written prayers in languages that predated humanity itself and in the great temples of the Draconis homeworld. They told the story of the Warm One, the human who had defied his own kind, who had given everything he had, who had loved children, not his own, so fiercely that he died keeping them alive. They carved his likeness in stone and crystal and precious metals. They composed songs in his honor that would be sung for millennia. They taught their young that true strength was not measured in battle prowess or territorial conquest, but in the courage to choose love when hate would have been easier. Daniel Cross had been born human, but he had become something more, a myth, a legend. A symbol of everything both species could be when they stopped seeing enemies and started seeing family, and in the hearts of every being who heard his story, human and Draconis alike, a small flame burned, the echo of warmth from a frozen cave. The legacy of a man who had proven that even in the darkest cold, a single spark of compassion could set the universe on fire. The dragons never forgot. They made him eternal, and in doing so, they reminded humanity of something it had almost lost. The truth that mercy is not weakness, that love is not foolishness, that the measure of a soul is not what it takes, but what it gives. Daniel Cross gave everything, and the universe was forever changed.